Thank you. Our speaker today is a professor of history at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. Her research focuses on public health activism, specifically the mobilization of various groups of citizens protesting environmental pollution and its effects on human and environmental health. Please welcome Dr. Amy Hay to the podium.
Good morning. Thank you very much for sharing this space and time with me. And I want to thank the Ethical Society for bringing me. I also want to especially thank Tony Wirtz and Andrea Jackson for all of their help. It was very much appreciated. So I should preface my remarks by saying this is research these are people that I study and write about. And I feel it's really important because these are ordinary people that were moved to take action by the problems they saw around themselves. And so the examples I'm going to draw from are from two major, what we would call anti-toxic grassroots activism. One is the Love Canal chemical disaster, which is a story of a community that discovered that their suburban neighborhood in Niagara Falls had been built over a uncontained waste site that had 22,000 hazardous chemicals dumped with a clay cap, and their homes and elementary school had been built on top of it. Because of the water table in Niagara Falls, the chemicals were buried in the 1950s and start to surface in the 1970s. So they're going to organize, mobilize, and then challenge state and federal authorities and state agencies to be relocated. And it's considered a success story. Over 900 families are going to be relocated away from the site and compensated. And then the second set of examples are drawn from my research on anti-toxics or phenoxy herbicide protests, right? So the phenoxy herbicides are chemicals that are growth inhibitors for plants. So they're considered to be ideal weed killers because they're selective. They are the primary components, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T are the primary components in Agent Orange. And I may refer to them as Agent Orange chemicals. So I should note that anti-toxic activism is much more widespread than I think many people realize, and it has a long history in the United States. Some of the problems that I think have kept it hidden, the premature death of Rachel Carson really hurt because she was an inspirational and widely recognized leader. The fact that many anti-toxic campaigns are led by women often means that they are not visibly public. They would be in the way they would be if they were led by men. And then they're also geographically separated, right? There's a geographic component to this that makes it difficult to coalesce into like national and international movements. Okay, so I'm going to start with a couple pictures. Okay, great. And if you notice, there's a skull and crossbones on the one flag, and you would think it would be a pirate flag, but no, it says Love Canal, right? So it's to indicate the toxicity that residents have discovered. And the young man's sign, I don't know if you can read it, it says, "We've got better things to do than sit around and be contaminated!" Exclamation, exclamation, right? And the picture next to it is another young boy, and his sign says, "Don't touch me, I'm contaminated by Love Canal," right? And so these would be common sites in the protests that the Love Canal activists, there's two organizations, the Homeowners Association and the Ecumenical Task Force, are involved in challenging state authorities to relocate these families. And so this is a really good picture of a common demonstration. So you would see children dressed in these various protest signs, mothers and families. So they're really centering their protests on the harm done to their families by the hazardous chemicals that they're living on top of. And so I think it's useful and the focus of what I'm going to talk about today is this idea of activists and protest, but art, right? So there's art in two meanings of the word. There's the creative, imaginative work that people do all the time, and then there's also the art or state of being, right? Like if you're really good at something, like a poker player, so you have the art of card playing, and I want us to be, I want to think about art in both senses of that word. And this is the image of Dr. Matthew Mieselson. He's a biologist from Harvard, and he was involved in the scientific protests against the use of the Agent Orange herbicides in South Vietnam. So this is, I think, okay, oh, I'm sorry, I'll try and be better. So this is a protest at Love Canal. So there's that young man who says, "Don't touch me, I'm contaminated." There's mothers, children, and that was a very typical demonstration that they would plan and hold. So then, this is Dr. Matthew Mieselson, and the idea of art is creative, but also a practice. And so this is, there are a lot of commonalities among these groups, and I would suggest these are also true of like other grassroots activist groups. They often have a similar experience that mobilizes, does the first initial mobilization. There are visual and written art in their protest materials and activities. There's going to be a changed understanding of the problem and what must be done. And there's sacrifice and sustaining ideals. And so this is, I think, a good example of the kind of art that I'm talking about. Michael Ryan was a serviceman in Vietnam. He was exposed to 2,4,5-T, right? He was exposed to Agent Orange. He came back. They did not have knowledge about the ways it would affect the genetics of soldiers. So he marries his sweetheart. They have a daughter. She is born with 21 birth abnormalities, right? And her name is Carrie Ryan. And they write a memoir, right? And I actually think of it as like an Agent Orange memoir. And if you look, can see it says Agent Orange and an American Family. So they are moved to take action by what has happened to their daughter, right? The father's exposure to Agent Orange and how that affected their family. There's a great documentary when Maureen Ryan basically says, at first I thought it was an act of God, and then I realized it was an act of Dow Chemical. Okay, so initial causes and influences, right? So this is going to be about initial causes, and I think the Love Canal story is representative of like many, many grassroots anti-toxic campaigns. So Lois Gibb is probably the best known individual and leader from Love Canal, and she goes on to become an activist in the rest of her life. And she experiences, she is like many activists, she experiences dismissal at best, sometimes denigration. Like it was really common at the time to call these housewives, right? Like these are just hysterical housewives. Why should we listen to them? And that really makes activists angry, right? So that's the genesis for their impetus to mobilize and organize. And I think the other picture here is revealing, right? So this is a child born who lived in Love Canal. She's having her blood drawn to test for possible chemical contamination. These are public health officials that are doing it, right? So you can see the fear, the fright on that child's face, but it also implies, to me, quite clearly that the enemy, right, the opposition are these public health officials, right? So there's ways that because of apathy, vested interest, power, when activists don't receive recognition and aid. I think we're seeing it right now happen in East Palestine in Ohio, right? There's a call for the elected officials, public officials, to take action, and they don't. And the community decides to do it for themselves. When we talk about influences in the anti-toxic campaigns that I study, Rachel Carson is the fundamental foundational figure, right? She is a gifted writer. She is a scientist. She had employment at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But she is such a gifted writer and has such a love of nature. She writes a trilogy about the sea, which I think is unfortunate because it's been neglected. And she is able to become a full-time writer. And is in that position as a public scientist who's gained people's trust, as a gifted nature writer, that people approach her with the concerns about the ways that pesticides like DDT are affecting wildlife. And so she writes Silent Spring. It's serialized in the New Yorker. It comes out in 1962. She's going to be attacked both by the US government and the chemical industry in deeply misogynistic ways. There's a great article, like there's a famous quote, "Silent Miss Carson." So there's real sense, and they're going to like attack her as a hysterical spinster. And her premature death shortly after the publication of Silent Spring, I think, really deprived the anti-toxic movements of a national, international leader. Okay, I'm going to talk then about 3 women in the West, and this is being drawn not from, these are all people who are challenging the use of Agent Orange chemicals in various settings. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I will be better. All right, so this is Billy Shoecraft, and she is a woman raised in the Midwest. She travels to Arizona to visit relatives. She falls in love with her husband, but also with the landscape. She's a poet, and so she is sprayed in 1968 by 2,4,5-T as a part of a Forest Service spraying campaign to decrease brush and hopefully increase water supplies for Phoenix. She and the other community members that who are sprayed are going to organize. They're going to challenge the Forest Service. Billy Shoecraft is going to go to Washington and testify at a congressional hearing. She's ill for a big, significant portion of this time. She died in 1976. She was of cancer that she was convinced that was caused at least in part by her exposure to the chemicals. There's a lawsuit that she and the other community members of Globe brought against the Forest Service that is going to be settled. So, there's a validation of the poor actions, right? The borderline illegal actions of the Forest Service and Dow. And she's also going to write what I think of as a deeply personal, very idiosyncratic memoir, and it's called Sue the Bastards. And she's a great example of someone who she acknowledges Rachel Carson's importance and her influence. And she's like, but Rachel Carson was too nice. It's time to take the gloves off, and it's time to sue the bastards. And that's where the title of the book comes from. And I'm not going to say that this is great art, but she routinely is including poetry in the memoir that's at times stream of consciousness. And this is the back cover with her picture. And you can see she actually prints a poem she wrote about her son's guinea pig. And I think it's interesting that metaphor comes up repeatedly among anti-toxic campaigners and activists. And so she embeds her creative energy within the book. And it's published by a local press in Arizona. And there are copies, if you check WorldCat, you can actually find copies across the country. The next person is Ida Honoraff. And so family history says that she participated at a bread riot in Chicago when she was 5. She supposedly organized unions in the 1930s during the Great Depression. She follows her husband west to California. They divorce. She becomes a consumer advocate. So she has a radio broadcast program on Pacifica Radio that broadcasts once a week. It's called A Report to the Consumer. She also writes and publishes and distributes a newsletter also entitled A Report to the Consumer. And in it, she seeks to enlighten Californians and others about the dangers of these chemicals, right? These Agent Orange chemicals that are being used throughout California. In Los Angeles, they were used for brush control because of the fires. They were used by the National Parks, Forest Service and the National Parks for timber control. And then because of California's extensive agricultural industry, they are also used throughout parts of the state for routine agricultural production. She also has a community of listeners, right? Shoecraft has the Globe community and the people she reaches out. She actually knows Honoraff, so they network. And so I have 2 images that appear in A Report to the Consumer, and I think give us room to think about like the kinds of art that protesters and activists create. So if you look at the first image, it's the globe. Oh, there, better. Is the globe, right? And hopefully you can see there are all these like aerial devices, right? There's a Wright brothers plane, there's parachutes, there's space rockets, right? So all of these ways that flying devices, basically. And then circling the globe are all these chemical company names. And to me, that really sends a potent message about the ways that the globe has been saturated with the chemicals produced by these companies. And so I think, and that's a pretty routine illustration that she would print in the newsletter. And then on the other side, and this is to me like representative of her sensibility, but it's also interesting, she commissioned this art. So if you see, there's a signature here in the bottom, John A. Dixon. So she actually paid someone to create this illustration for this issue of the newsletter. And if you look at it, it is not a very flattering portrait of Uncle Sam here in the front, right? A very disreputable individual who's flinging babies, right, into the air. In the background, we see this cloud with a demon at the top, a helicopter that looks like it might have been in Vietnam, and a family. And there's this toxic cloud with droplets of 2,4-D, 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T, 2,4-DP. And it really, I think, is meant to be provocative, right, to poke people. But I also think it, in some respects, captures the sensibility that I think, and humor that I think a lot of activists take, which is the world might be ending tomorrow, but we're gonna speak truth to power while it happens. And I think that's one way that, as a historian, we're very hesitant about emotions. Looking at the art, the written art, visual art that is produced by activists is one way that we get a window or glimpse into how they feel and how they're sustaining themselves. So the final activist in the West is a woman named Carol Van Strom. She and her husband are going to move to Five Rivers, Oregon, right? So it's in timber country. And they're hoping to farm, and she's hoping to actually write. When they're relocated, her children are going to be sprayed by 2,4-D by a road crew that's removing brush along the access road to a timber stand. And the kids come home, she gets sick washing their clothes, their dog gets sick, and she and her husband actually research the chemicals being used and realize that these are pretty serious chemicals with serious effects, and they're going to organize, it's like a regional community, and they're going to create Citizens Against Toxic Sprays, or CATS. They are going to bring a lawsuit against the relatively new Environmental Protection Agency and make the charge that the environmental impact statement was done incorrectly. So they're using the legal system and a regulatory agency to fight back against the vested interests of the timber companies and chemical industry. Van Strom is going to write a book that chronicles this story. She is sensitive to a nearby group of women who are also being active and visible because they're claiming that the chemical sprays have caused miscarriages. She includes the story of Vietnam vets who are now also starting to mobilize and be active in protesting their exposure during the Vietnam War. So she writes The Bitter Frog, and I should point out there's a new edition that's been released, so it's actually available for purchase. But I think her short story, Melise, is a really good example of the ways that she's using art and the written word to speak and send out the message. So this story's genesis was there was a Dow Chemical executive, the public relations officer, and he claimed that the reason activists were upset about the spraying happening in the Pacific Northwest was not because they were experiencing ill effects, but because it was eradicating their marijuana crops, right? And that these were radical hippies. And it sounds silly, but it was a powerful message. Other groups in the area, these women in nearby Alsace who were like protesting about the miscarriage effects, actually disassociated themselves from CATS, in part because there's almost a hint of anti-communism going on. She writes this story, and it's great because it's about a mother who marches into the county office and says, my baby's having bloody diapers. Do you think that's from smoking too much marijuana? And so it's a really powerful piece, and I think that is representative of the kind of art and action that activists took to try, to create an alternative and truer narrative. So I want to talk a little bit. I should mention this is Carol. This is her second husband, Paul Merrill, who is a Vietnam veteran. And you can see the no spray sign, and this is both sides of the road, right? So she is actually still alive and still active as an environmental activist. So I want to talk, oh, I'm sorry, this was the book, Melise. I want to talk a little bit about how activists are changed through their experiences. And this is a great example. This is another illustration from my report to the consumer. So it gives you a sense of the kind of visuals that routinely appeared. But if you think about it, one of the really important things, especially in the anti-toxics activism, is people go from understanding things as individual problems to realizing that these are societal issues, right? It's really common in anti-toxics literature for people to dismiss concerns by saying, oh, that's just a NIMBY, right? Like, you just don't want bad things in your backyard. And one of the really inspirational things that these activists do is they're like, no, we don't want it in anyone's backyard, right? Everybody's backyard should be clean and healthy. So they realize, they're trying to split us, keep us individual, isolated. And we're really talking about like a societal problem that we all need to act to speak to and not blame the victim in essence. One of the things, this next point I think is really important, especially to us right in our current moment, is this idea of recognition of the way science is used to bolster authority of government and industry, right? And I think at least in my perception, one of the fundamental problems is we have scientific expertise and we have scientific authority. And those are not necessarily the same thing. It is true that there are scientists and medical authorities that are empowered to act upon that expertise, and they may hold formal authority. Public health departments are a great example of that. But one of the problems is there's a significant gap, and it's not just on the part of lay individuals, right, ordinary citizens. Often when I've presented my research, people will say, oh, do you think it would have been different if they just knew more science, right? So it's like kind of the ignorance of the activists that's the problem. Yes, they have some formal education that they may not have. They may not understand, scientific formulas, but they have the experience of their bodies, right? They literally are the evidence themselves. And then you have the scientists, right? Engineers, public health officials. There are two problems, right? Especially when we talk about the phenoxy herbicides. Those are all developed in laboratories, right? Under controlled conditions. Chemists aren't always good about recognizing that what happens in the lab may not be duplicated or may be complicated in the field, right? So I think there's a certain hubris there. And I would also argue that there's a gap in empathy and understanding, right? I don't think the guinea pig metaphor is accidental, because many community residents recognize, hey, you're okay with this happening to us, but you would never live here. You would never want to have your family here. So there's ways that I would argue that we should push the scientific community to recognize that empathy is not unprofessional, it's not unscientific, it should be a routine part of your professional life. And then finally, I think, and this is true of like almost every grassroots movement I've ever studied, there's a real push for democracy, right? These individuals are angry about the ways that chemical policy and regulation is outside their hands. I mean, especially when we're talking about chemicals that are sprayed from the sky. They're really vulnerable, and they recognize that, and they're pushing to be recognized as stakeholders, and the idea that they expect elected officials to protect them, right? That's one of the fundamental pieces of democracy that they see being violated. And I think that's a powerful moment for many activists, right? So they may have come in apolitical, they may have actually come in fairly conservative, for limited government. And because of that, the experiences they have and what they start to learn other people are experiencing, it's a radical transformation of their outlook. So I want to talk a little bit about sacrifices, right? And this is a picture of Carol Van Strom's house. She experienced a house fire, and her 4 children were killed in it. She claims or suspects that it was industry set by, arson set by the industry. And I want to point out that sounds maybe fairly paranoid, but I think it reveals how difficult it can be to be an activist challenging entrenched authority. And so, there's this saying, I might be paranoid, but it doesn't mean I'm wrong. And I think that may apply in this situation. And This is, not even a recent picture after the fire. She's never able to fully rebuild the house. So there's effect on professional lives, right? So a good example is Dr. Beverly Pagan, who's a cancer researcher at the Roswell Cancer Institute in Buffalo. She's going to help the Love Canal activists. She plays a really important part. She is retaliated against at her job, right? So they actually do an investigation. I've seen the report. It's pretty nasty. James Allen is a researcher at Wisconsin, and he is publishing work on the phenoxy herbicides and the potential health effects. He does financial mismanagement of a grant, and they use that financial mismanagement to undermine his science. And that's actually a very common industry practice, and I've been encouraged because you talk to many scientists now, they're aware of the ways they have to protect younger scientists that are doing important work. Then there are the effects on personal lives. Reputation is one. Billy Shoecraft was profiled in Time magazine, and it was really surprising. They basically called her a crackpot. It was so bad that her friends said that she should sue for defamation. And so, that was a national magazine read by everybody with her picture. Marriages, right? Family. So Lois Gibbs divorces her first husband, marries the scientific expert that the state had assigned to help the Love Canal Homeowners Association. Carol Venstrom divorces her first husband, remarries a Vietnam veteran who himself is suffering from PTSD, and is also heavily involved in anti-Agent Orange activism. She divorces him. Children are affected. I talked to Ida's daughter, and she, as an adult, can recognize the really important work her mom was doing, but it was difficult growing up. Her dad was mad that she kept his name as she was an activist. And there's a great story of Lois Gibbs' son having to have coffee cake for his birthday because his mom forgot to get a cake, and that was the only sweet they had in the house. So I think there are generational effects that hopefully people can come to peace with, but can have unfortunate effects. And then I would say economic insecurity. I mean, it's not just that these individuals they aren't able to hold another job, but they sacrifice time, they sacrifice money, they pour their hearts into these activities, to network, to call people, to do phone chains, to set up marches, to contact legislators. So it's more than a full-time job in and of itself. And so I think that can affect their, their economic stability. But what I think is really important, and I'm glad that we're going to end on this note, is why I think the kind of things that sustain activists, right? So in a very real sense, activists act, right? So I teach environmental history, and I routinely, and this is an issue at environmental history conferences, what do you do when you get to the climate change section and you start to talk to students, and they're pretty depressed? And that's not what you want to do. You do not want to send them out into the world convinced that everything is hopeless and it's all over. And that's one of the reasons I think activism is a great entry point, because activists act. They may not succeed. They have a lot of failures, but they take action, and there is power in that. They commit. Sometimes I don't think always appreciate that when activists are in our face, but I think it's really important to respect the commitment that they make. I can remember I was teaching at Michigan State. They were trying to get the campus to protest grapes because of the farm workers. And I had students come in, and they were making fun of it. They were going to eat grapes in front of the activists. And I was like, what? I was completely dumbfounded because they didn't recognize that commitment, that power. Activists inspire. I think Rachel Carson is a great example, right? She is a trusted public scientist. She uses her writing skills to inspire not just Americans, right? Not just the hundreds and thousands of Americans, but globally. And that's a powerful legacy, and I think is an important gift that activists give to us. And then finally, I would say they empower us, right? I often tell my students it's one action at a time. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. We want you to support, and through that support, take small steps, and small steps become bigger steps, and then that's how we make the change that we need to make happen. Thank you very much.
Gesundheit.